Not if I see you first. My eyes and ears, you give notice that light is moon-colored this evening. The wet wind has stopped, and clouds are no object. You tell me, look up and listen for more specific directions, as if we could fly to where your observations originate. What you describe makes a second sight more intense and more lasting than my own impressions. Reality tells me you're what I can trust. You make time for the senses to take, unrehearsed. One day I'll wake up and get a taste of unmediated experience, a sunrise that signifies undiscussed, but only if I don't see you first. That's a poem from Brad Buchanan's book, The Miracle Shirker, from 2005. I'm Bob Stanley, and I'm here with Brad Buchanan for the November edition of Coffee and Poets here at Twin Lotus Thai Restaurant in Sacramento. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Bob.
You ever heard that poem read to you before?
No, I have not. I definitely like your rendition of it, and it takes me back quite a long way in time and space.
And you've been writing, you have 3 books since then. But The Miracle Shirker was your first book of poems?
Yes, it was, yeah. And I think for a while you referred to me as the old Miracle Shirker, Brad Buchanan, which is fair enough.
Well, you're still young. So Brad is professor emeritus from Sacramento State, CSU Sacramento. He's the author of academic articles and books and at least 4 collections of poetry, which I was honored to have, and I kind of went through and found some stuff to read from all of them. But I guess one question I have is, I don't know if you're still writing academic works, but you were writing, for journals, academic journals, and you were writing poetry at the same time. How did you balance that? What drove you and what nourished you as you did all that?
Good question. I don't know that I balanced anything. I kind of threw myself headlong into one thing and then pushed that as far as it could go. And then I would throw myself headlong into something different. But poetry is the constant, I suppose, in my writing life. Even if I'm writing some other project, something in prose, let's say, I always have poetry there as a resource for when reality or something happening in my life presses on me in a particularly urgent way, and I need to get something down on the page to express what I'm feeling in that moment. Because the life of a prose writer is very short on thrills. You have to have a long attention span, a lot of patience, and you have to let whatever you're writing kind of develop as you start in on it. In my case, I usually end up doing research for my prose books and let them percolate for a long time before you're ready to show them to the world. Whereas poems are, I don't know if they're moments of inspiration, but they're moments of extreme feeling anyway, where language has to be found for what's going on inside of me or any writer in order to feel like you can move on from that moment into the rest of your life, where hopefully the feelings, that you've expressed become positive aspects of your life and milestones, as opposed to pressed emotions that will haunt you and drive you to self-destructive behaviors.
And poetry is not a self-destructive behavior.
No. I mean, I think if poets have a reputation for being self-destructive, it's not the fault of poetry, I would say. It's just an index to how life is destructive to us as sensitive human beings. And sometimes we can't write out all the feelings in time. And some things are just too hard to write about. But I want to rescue poetry from the poets, I suppose you could say, as a therapeutic, as an active, self-therapy first and foremost, but also as a way to try to communicate with a small but dedicated group of poetry readers out there that, have been very important to me locally in Sacramento, first and foremost.
So you talk about poetry as a therapeutic and something that helps you deal with adversity. And of course, you went through a terrible illness and still, kind of on the other side of that. Are there any instances? I'm guessing there was a time when you didn't write, but when you came back to writing, how did that feel, and how did that work for you?
Well, yeah, there was about 6 months where I just couldn't put anything down on paper. My mother, who was in town to help me, after my stem cell transplant, kept saying, well, surely there's something you can say about that experience. And I said, well, I have 3 words for you, Mom. Crouched over darkness. That summed up a lot of the experience I had, and I couldn't really add to that, in part because I was badly visually impaired at that time too, as well as still very, very ill from graft versus host disease, which was the unintended and acute side effect of my stem cell transplant. So the way writing happened for me eventually in that time was I found ways of writing, poems, maybe 10 words to a page. I wrote in huge printed letters that I would then hand to a college student who I paid $20 an hour to be my secretary, and then she would transcribe them onto my computer, and eventually I'd have something I could send out submission. But at that point, I was writing about my blindness more than anything else, since that was I'd been sick before. I no longer had cancer. I had another disease that I was having trouble even finding words to describe, graft versus host disease, which is a very paradoxical genetic alteration in the self. Eventually, I did manage to write about that, but in the moment, what was most interesting to me was life as a blind person and walking around Sacramento with a white cane, just having the experiences that you have when you're walking around somewhere looking different than other people. And those poems were supposed to come out in a chapbook years ago, but the press has, not a local press, I'm happy to say, press in Texas has failed to deliver on its promise. But yeah, those were the poems I wrote at first once I had recovered my wits sufficiently to start writing poetry again.
I know you memorize a lot of poems. Do you have any of them committed to memory?
No, I do not. One starts, a blind man knows what his pockets hold, like the back of his hand, etc. There was another about walking around Sacramento and hearing people commenting on my cane as if I were, one of them said, oh, I thought you were walking an invisible dog. I'm like, what? And then we had a long conversation where he said, well, that was a fad in New York at some point in the 70s. I'm like, okay, well, I have this fad called being blind that I'm really into these days. So I have this white cane that helps me navigate. But hey, you do you, buddy. Other people, they thought I had some kind of antenna on the end that I was sending signal. Well, these people were drunk, but whatever. Asking, dude, are you blind? Dude, are you blind? And then I had a bit of tape at the end of my cane that some people thought was just genius. They thought I should patent that and make millions of dollars. Again, drunks who were sort of following me around out of curiosity as I tried to go about my business as a blind person in Sacramento. So given a bit of time, I suppose I could call those up on my phone, but no, those I haven't managed to memorize those because they, in a way, they sort of belong to that very brief period in my life where blindness was the only thing I could write about. And I'm not sure they're my best work. I know they're certainly not the best poems ever written about blindness. That's for sure.
So that line, crouching over darkness, it's almost like a a 3-word book right there. That's what happened from that 6-month period.
That's all I could say about it at that time. Yeah, but the poems in Chimera really dig back into that period and retell the story of my stem cell transplant in pretty gory detail. For some, I suppose, it makes for strong meat. But for me, it was really important to reprocess what had happened to me and why I was still so very ill, despite having been quote unquote cured of cancer. I mean, and that cure was only temporary too, because I soon learned I had a second form of blood cancer that was a consequence of my immune suppressed condition after the stem cell transplant itself. So I knew I wasn't done with cancer by any means. But anyway, I wanted, the reason why the book is entitled Chimera is because I am genetically considered to be what the medical establishment in its wonderful metaphorical wisdom has decided is a genetic chimera, someone with 2 different types of DNA. Why they chose that mythical creature to describe someone in my condition, I don't know, but it was certainly a rich enough image to try to conjure with and to write about and to claim. And these days, I'm no longer Brad the Miracle Shirker. I'm Brad the Chimera. I stopped shirking the miracles, and the stem cell transplant is itself kind of a medical miracle that I finally had to come to grips with. Although, as one of the poems in Chimera says, the rituals of those who find they are miracles are difficult, painful rituals that involve a lot of guilt and regret as well.
Do you have any poems from Chimera that you'd be willing to recite?
Yeah, for sure. Probably the one that encapsulates the experience for me best is called BMTU 5771, which sets the stage, I suppose, for what happened to me, and then delivers a sort of end verdict on how almost my humanity itself got lost in the process. And here it is, BMTU 5771. Sid the Kid Crosby's golden goal. Hunter Pence's bat shattering into 3 pieces and dying a hero. These were the pictures on the wall when I, blind and distracted, tried to pull my own plug. The beeping machine wouldn't stop, and I'd had enough. Some sweet liquid spilled out, and my nurse was upset. I had rolled in my own shit again. Somehow there was barbed wire all over the vacant lot in which I'd been trying to plant a garden. The people on the cruise ship were fed up with that fucked up endless regatta. They licked red vomit from envelopes and wanted more. 2 medications met in my brain and fought to a standstill. Waking delirium went on the record. Sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, my very best symptoms didn't quite match what they were expecting. Another experience lost its meaning in the wild, unfocused light of the dawn. Nothing had changed but my tubes and the temperature, which was unbearable. I was a fire, smoldering in a pile of damp leaves and flaking fungus, neither alive nor able to die in a recognized manner. I became that unit's room number and was known as 71 thereafter.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Brad Buchanan. We're here at Coffee and Poets at Twin Lotus Thai, and from his book Chimera, which is a record of his part of his battle with stem cell and cancer and all kinds of. I mean, it was so complicated. You need like a map to figure it out. 2022, not that long ago, this book came out.
Yeah.
The line, the 2 medications met in my brain and fought to a standstill. There's other poems where you're addressing your medications or the personification of your medications is kind of scattered throughout the book, and it's always kind of amazing. You had so many, you became so familiar with them, and you said goodbye to them, and you said hello to them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, indeed. The two in question were mirtazapine, which is an antidepressant that I still take, and Ativan, which was supposed to be a sleep medication. But for some reason in my metabolism, they did not coexist well. For some people, that mixture would have been fine. For me, it was a recipe for recurrent nightmares and ultimately a kind of almost schizoid episode around 2 o'clock in the morning when I summoned a nurse and I said, I want you to tell the doctors, like, I am having what feels like a psychic breakdown. I need to get off one of these medications and I don't know which one. And finally, they took me off the Ativan and increased my Remeron dose, and those nightmares went away, thank goodness. But it took at least a week, or it felt like a week anyway, of these awful recurring nightmares before, they figured out what to do with me. But yeah, I was on so many medications and pills, powders, etc., that it felt like a labyrinthine maze of chemicals from which I didn't know if I would ever emerge with anything like a coherent, sane human identity any longer. So it was a lot to manage, and I've done my best to describe it in ways that people might be able to relate to, but some of it I think people just go, oh, and don't know what to make of it, and I don't really even blame them.
Well, I think you've done a pretty amazing job of taking, all these experiences and putting them into poems. I mean, Chimera's got like 70 or 80 poems in there. Some are more harrowing than others. There's actually a little bit of humor, infused in there at times as well. So what was interesting to me reading through your books is that I feel like the voice is still, there's just kind of that dry humor that was there in Swimming the Mirror in 2008 is there in Chimera or The Scars Aligned, your later books. So,
well, yeah, and even the poems about chemicals, like the one to prednisone, which I think you were referring to, is called Farewell My Medicine, and maybe I could recite that now to give people an idea. Maybe some people might not see the humor in the poem. It is intended to be somewhat humorous, and it goes like this. Saying goodbye to prednisone is a painful affair, like leaving a lover who alternately soothed and stimulated, on whom you doted on a daily basis, an intoxicating nonentity you nevertheless depended upon when your senses and membranes were inflamed, when desire could find no other way. The addictive squeeze you must quit cold turkey before the massive organ failure, before the porous bones can shatter, before you inherit another disaster. High maintenance flirt you will never master, you son of a bitch, who nursed you like a mother, then cursed you like a vindictive father, and at whom you will gaze the next time they walk past with incredulous lust and dumbass tenderness. Ha ha.
Farewell to prednisone.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was definitely one of the more ambivalent relationships I had with a drug, because I know in the beginning prednisone helped to contain my graft versus host disease, control the inflammation it was producing in my body, but in the long run it is very toxic and suppresses your immune system. And anyway, but yeah, it took like at least 3 concerted efforts to finally get off prednisone, where I wouldn't have a flare-up of my GVHD that would make me so miserable that I needed to go on 40 mgs of this stuff, So it was definitely a love-hate relationship, but ultimately one that was toxic.
So if we go back in your poetic career, I mean, poetry seems to be the one thing that you've always needed to do. Even when you couldn't, you scribbled in large letters and then had it transcribed. Poetry's always been a drive for you.
Yeah.
What are some of your influences? When did you? What was it that got you into poetry? And what are some poets that influenced you?
Yeah, I mean, I've written poetry for a long time. At first in school, when they tell you to write something, I had a high school teacher who wanted us to write a sonnet. And I remember pacing up and down my bedroom, like counting out the syllables and the stresses and, getting one of my few good grades in that year of high school anyway, from that teacher who saw that I accomplished a form. But then basically modernism came along in my life and blew the cover off most traditional poetic forms. So my big influences were people like T.S. Eliot, more recently, well, Dylan Thomas, who is a formal poet, but I couldn't imitate him by any means. Sylvia Plath also was a big influence on me. I was kind of a thrill seeker in language. So, yeah, I don't know. But it just seemed like the most urgent form of human communication is poetry, something that a human being would say to another human being, just and automatically be understood and relatable on a pretty profound emotional level. The poems could cut through all the bull, that we use language for to communicate something important and enduring about our humanity, to put it in a very broad way. But yeah, I mean, I've read hundreds and hundreds of different poems and poets, I should say. So I don't know. My favorite current poet is Geoffrey Hill, who began as a very formal poet very much in the British tradition, and then who gradually loosened up to write almost stream of consciousness, self-satire in his later years. He was dealing with acute depression, as well as he was wrestling with the entirety of British history. And, he was fascinated with the bloody battles, let's say, of the Wars of the Roses. Anyway, just a poet who could deal beautifully with nature as well as describe a horrific battlefield after essentially, thousands of human beings had died on the field, and he could straddle those two extremes of beauty and terror.
Jeffrey with a G?
Geoffrey Hill.
And he was 19th century?
No, he only just died fairly recently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was Oxford professor of poetry in sometime this millennium.
I have to check him out.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a strong poet. I'll just call it. I'll say that.
Does he have so you feel like you aspire to delve into some of the things that he delves into?
He convinces me of the potential that poetry has to just, cut deeply and sharply into human experience at any angle, essentially. He's also an amazing scholar and critic of poetry. Anyway, I'll just leave my recommendation to dangle there. But,
I like that metaphor, the ability to cut deeply and sharply into human experience at every angle. It's like we're carving a chicken. And now you're professor emeritus, so you're not teaching at the college. You don't have to deal with the 20-year-olds who don't care about James Joyce, but you're facilitating Amherst-style workshops, and you're helping people tell their own stories. And how do you like that? How do you find that process?
I find it rewarding, actually, because I think there's a real need for people. I think everyone everyone who can read and write has the potential to engage in writing in a therapeutic way to cope with whatever's going on in their lives. I mean, I've tried to focus my outreach on people who have experienced similar things to me. So through the UC Davis Cancer Center and also other cancer centers around the country, I've had a lot of interest to run these online workshops. I'm trying to reach the patients at the cancer centers, but that turns out to be logistically almost impossible and very, very frustrating if that's your sole aim. But I often end up giving these workshops for the staff members of these cancer centers who have more easily managed schedules than patients who are acutely ill in treatment or at home outside of the institution's easy reach. So yeah, I've ended up doing a lot of writing workshops for staffs at cancer centers. I did a couple through the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society where we did 4-week online writing workshops. I think it was really important for the people involved. The thing about the Amherst Writers and Artists workshopping method is we only offer positive feedback. We say what we liked in the piece, as opposed to grading let's say a poem in a creative writing class where you ought to explain why you don't think this poem is a grade, and I'm not sure I could ever go back to that model of responding to writing. I just think people should be encouraged to write, even if they're not writing stuff that I would deem to be of great literary merit. In fact, I've sort of decided that the whole question of literary merit is kind of unimportant, that what matters is what matters in writing is whether the writer is engaging with the important emotional tasks that life has imposed on them, healing from trauma, let's say, or just coping with everyday challenges and frustrations on whatever level they choose to cope with them. So that's where I'm at these days with my involvement with other people's writing. And of course, I write in these workshops too, ideally, when other people are writing as well. So I get my own work done at the same time in a perfect world.
That's great. And I didn't know that you were, in a sense, teaching the teachers. When you're working with the staff, then the staff can go and work with the patient. So that's kind of multiplies your influence.
Well, yeah, I was supporting the support staff, let's say, because, yeah, I mean, in the pandemic and after the pandemic, I think medical staff, especially at cancer centers, have really experienced a lot of burnout, which is logical, jives with what we know about medical, just the shortage of medical personnel during the pandemic itself, but also it's what they're telling me too. They're extremely burned out, and the pandemic produced some kind of unfortunate systemic changes in a lot of medical institutions that mean that the staff are now really overstretched, underappreciated.
Well, and Amherst Writers is a great organization too. I mean, we have a number of people here in town that have done it on and off, and
yeah. Well, and Jan Haig was nice enough to let me sit in on her workshop, which is run along those lines. When I was thinking of getting something analogous going to the UC Davis Cancer Center. So yeah, it's a method that works. Offering writers a safe space to write, first of all, and then to share their words, secondly, is the most important thing that I think any workshop can possibly do. Mind you, I do go to a writing workshop on Friday nights in town where we rip into each other's poems like wild dogs. But even there, we are the play. It's made safe by the fact that we have, long-standing relationships with each other, and we know deep down we respect each other. But yeah, that's a very different kind of workshop that I'm not in the business of proselytizing for.
So I wanted to read another one of your poems. And this one is the book that you Swimming the Mirror, 2008, which is subtitled Poems for My Daughter. And I came across this one I liked. There was a lot of poems I liked in here, maybe a little more lighthearted, but still kind of that dry wit. And it's called Her Song of Hunger. I have stopped pretending that life makes sense, partly because I don't deserve the joy that shrieks at me now from her chair, smeared with Cheerios, applesauce, and the other ineffable messes of breakfast. The scream is high-pitched, intolerable, and necessary. The child who makes it is well-fed and happy, and yet she yells because even a beautiful world needs a shrill, discordant note. It's the newness that brings each day to light, whether we're ready for it or not. And we aren't. Though we won't remember why when it's dark again and our ears are still ringing like holiday bells from Her Song of Hunger. So you were, right, kind of dealing with the joys and the frustrations of having, little kids and
Yeah. Well, I mean, that poem is really hitting me now because Nora, the baby whose song of hunger is being described in that poem, is now an English major in college where she is studying poetry and writing her own poetry. So the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. And yeah, I don't know, that book to me is just, it's pure happiness.
that's good. So whatever's happening in your life, you're chronicling it in your poems.
I mean, it was happiness that was at times almost shocking in its urgency, right? The baby needs to be fed. It's my morning to feed the baby, so I got to go in there and cope with the screaming that's going on. But it was a happy form of coping that, having written so many poems about coping with difficult, painful, life-threatening situations, the life-affirming enterprise of being a parent. Now, I mean, it seems more important than ever to me that I wrote those poems, even though at the time, self-publishing a book about the joys of being a parent seemed like kind of a bad professional move. But I'm very happy that I did so in a way so that my later poems about my children and so forth have kind of a grounding in my feeling of delight and joy that they were happy, healthy kids and remain so, really. Yeah, because fatherhood was by far the most transformative experience of my life before cancer came a calling. Actually, being a parent was the thing that motivated me most to survive, frankly, because I knew my kids still needed me to be their dad, even when survival was kind of a painful, it was somewhat unattractive proposition. I would have done anything I could possibly do just to get out of there, and one or two pieces, as long as the pieces were alive, to somehow crawl back into the role of a father, which I kind of did almost literally, crawl back to resume that role. So they were my biggest reason for continuing to fight, if that's the word you want to use, all these various illnesses. So thank you for reading that.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting that Nora is writing poetry and an English major. We need English majors, and I'm sure Nora is going to be a good one. So.
Yeah, she's extremely happy to be doing what she's doing right now. She might have chosen a more practical major, but I'm not going to complain.
So, So to close, what are you working on? What new projects or what new directions are you interested in going with your art, with your poetry or your teaching, or what are you aiming for?
Well, this is a good question and very timely because I'm working on another book of prose this time, but with poetry embedded in it, because it's a book about writing as a therapeutic act, asking questions like, do the metaphors that we use in describing our illness matter when we are trying to use writing in a therapeutic way? So to take this battle metaphor that I've just used, right? My battle with cancer or with GVHD or whatever, is writing with violent metaphors like that a health giving or a health destructive kind of way of thinking? And I've kind of gone back and forth multiple times on this. And what's fascinating right now is that there are a bunch of studies out there that measure the physiological effects of writing in a therapeutic mode. They they have measured things like people's blood pressure, the levels of cortisol in their bodies after they write a certain kind of emotionally open, expressive writing, and they chart their overall medical situations over months and months after a single episode of therapeutic writing where they're encouraged to be emotionally open. And it's become very clear that expressive writing is amazingly important for people's overall health, especially if they're coping with a chronic illness, as I still am, or dealing with a trauma that is affecting their life in some way, a few months after it's occurred. So this is a very rich field of scientific study right now. And the evidence seems to be that writing using these military metaphors, right? I won my battle against cancer, or in the case of my mother, she lost her battle with cancer. That's a double-edged enterprise, right? Because on the one hand, those metaphors kind of activate the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight reflex, where you have to basically, you're fighting for your life, essentially. Is it healthy to tap into that after the fact? Or is it better to say, no, once I've survived, that initial moment where I did need to kind of put on the cancer warrior hat to go in to get my treatments, because basically I was chicken and super squeamish and didn't like the sight of a needle, let alone the idea that they were going to plant a catheter in my chest to pump a bunch of chemo in that was going to damage my body and then get more radiation and so on and so forth. It all sounded horrible. So I had to be like soldier-like to go in and just take all those punches. But after the fact, I've kind of become allergic to that discourse to some extent. I use the fight metaphor in quotation marks because I think in the long term, it's much better to disconnect from those fight or flight reflexes and to think of your medical history as not a war, but a quest, let's say. The journey metaphor is also, I would say more, it's a healthier metaphor than the battle, the war metaphor for me as I see things. But I love the idea of a quest because a quest is something where you have to be active, you're seeking something, and at the end, you found it and you are transformed by what you have found at the end of your quest. So it's not just a journey where you're like lugging some massive burden around wherever the hell you're going with no particular object except arriving at a destination. So but again, there's a lot of, hard science that I'm having to juggle as I express my own feelings on the subject and recognize very fully that I absolutely needed those battle metaphors at certain times in my life as a patient. So this book is, I hope, going to be kind of a summary of first a review of the literature, right? Here's what the scientists have said, and then here's what whatever the philosophers, the other memoirists, the people who have written extensively on this topic have shared. And then here's my experience and what I wrote and what I felt and what I did at every stage of this long, weird quest that I've been on to arrive here at Twin Lotus Thai, talking to Bob Stanley about all of it, bringing it right up to date in this moment where I'm still writing about my illness as it unfolds, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. So I would say that project will take a few years to flesh out, at the very least.
Well, it's interesting that it's kind of a combination of your academic and your literary pursuits, and it kind of brings the poetry with the science. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and I'm having to do a lot of research on it for sure, and I'm activating some of the analytical faculty, I suppose I pretended to have when I was a professor and writing books on Shakespeare or Joyce or whoever. But also tapping into my, the core of my writing self, which is really poetry. And I hope I don't betray the poetry by overanalyzing it or oversimplifying it to view it in this context. But it to me, this is a way of making sense of it all that I hope will help other people who are coping with something similar in their experience. It's also using the wisdom, I suppose, if I can say I've garnered any wisdom, or just the experiential lessons I've learned through doing the online writing workshops, that the importance of those workshops is finding a safe space to write and a community in which you can share those words, who will be supportive to you and who will listen and be your audience and accept you as one of them. Because I think that's the final phase of the writing as therapy process, right? It's not just writing on your own, but then telling your story or sharing your words with people who will respond in a supportive manner and accept you as one of them because they too are doing something similar. And that really closes the loop on the whole experience, and I think maximizes the healing potential of writing.
Well, and we had some of your students or people you've been working with facilitating their writing. We had them here at Twin Lotus a couple of weeks ago, and I feel like that was a good place to close that circle. It seemed like they had a wonderful time, and it was a supportive audience, and I know you were having a good time watching them.
Oh, it was so rewarding to see them here, to hear them also reading their work. And these were people, a couple of them, we had tried to meet and write together in person at the Society for the Blind, but we never wrote anything when we were together in one room because people hadn't brought their preferred writing technology. But through Zoom, we went online and people could write at home with whatever their machine was and share words that way in the workshop setting. But getting back together with some of them in person, as you say, Bob, it 100% closed the loop. And they were so grateful and delighted of the chance to do that and to feel the appreciation in this very room from some of these same people who are here today in a way that, I don't think any of them could possibly have anticipated experiencing when we started the workshop. It's probably been about 4 years now.
Well, Brad, keep up the great work with your students and the staff you're working with, and of course, and this exciting project too. That'll be really interesting to hear more about that. And I'm sure there are more poems brewing as we speak. So, thank you for being here today.
It's been my pleasure, Bob. Thank you for having me.
Okay, this is Coffee and Poets. We're here at Twin Lotus Thai. Lawrence Dinkins is our producer. This is I believe about the 40th iteration of Coffee and Poets. It's on NSAA 360 is his YouTube channel, and all the Coffee and Poets are there. You can see Susan Kelly
Cool.
DeWitt and Catherine Holbein and Kuhn the
fantastic.
Poet and all kinds of great people. So thanks to Twin Lotus Thai, and that wraps it up for Coffee and Poets in November 2023.